Welcome to the 12th Annual Illinois Education and Career Success Network. I'm Edith Njuguna, and I'm the Network Director. On behalf of the network organizers, Advance Illinois, Education System Center at NIU, and the Illinois Student Assistance Commission, thank you for being here. We had 300 registrants from over 85 communities across the state, and we're thrilled that you could join us. And so it's 2025, and many of you may recall that when the network was created in 2013, it was known as the Illinois 60 by 25 network. And this reflected a goal by the Illinois P20 Council that 60% of Illinois adults should have a high-quality degree or career credential by 2025. And this was in response to the Lumina Foundation's goal that showed that most jobs that pay a family-sustaining wage would require more than a high school diploma. And so Illinois is at 57.3% right now. And so we're making, yes, you can. And so we're making good progress. But when you look at disaggregated data, whether it's by race, socioeconomic status, or geography, we see that there are huge disparities. And we will hear more from our keynote speaker, Dr. Del Pilar, about the importance of looking at disaggregated data. So when Advance Illinois Education System Center and the Illinois Student Assistance Commission came together in 2013, it was in response to the growth of a number of collaboratives that were coming up across the state where folks were working together to advance post-secondary attainment. And we recognized the need for a statewide infrastructure to support these communities. And so our three organizations came together around an idea. What if we created a network that would bring together these local collaboratives so that they could learn from one another, share best practices, and serve as exemplars to others across the state around how to use the guiding principles of collective impact to advance post-secondary attainment. At the same time, we wanted to make sure that what was happening at the local level helped inform what was happening at the state level, and vice versa. And so our goal is to support communities to increase meaningful and equitable post-secondary attainment. And when we talk about meaningful, we want to ensure that we are encouraging students to identify goals that they are passionate about and that lead to family-sustaining wages. And when we talk about equitable, we want to make sure that we are reaching students who are farthest from opportunity. And so from the first conference in 2014, a statewide movement was created that's making an impact both at the community level and the student level. And from here, leadership communities were born. And these are communities that have brought folks from different sectors together. They've signed an MOU to work together to advance post-secondary attainment. They've identified a geographic focus area. They've committed to using data for continuous improvement and are working on a regular basis to learn from one another and share best practices. And we were excited to welcome 2 new communities this year, Highland Region Pathways to Success and Chicago Southland Collaborative for Education. Let's give them a round of applause. Becoming a leadership community is a lot of work. It takes time to bring folks together, to think about what you want to focus on, come up with your goals, and I want to recognize the other 18 leadership communities that are here. If you have the name of a leadership community on your badge, please stand up. And if you don't have a name, but you're from a leadership community, please stand up. Well, thank you for all that you do. And so the network continues to deepen its work, and we have broad reach. We are reaching about 47% of all high school students in Illinois. And so the network is helping move the field forward and support leadership communities in a number of ways. We provide peer-to-peer learning opportunities, technical assistance on a variety of topics. We gather and curate critical data that we can use, communities can use to inform decisions. We seek funding, which we give to communities to implement key strategies. And we organize conferences like this and regional meetings for communities to learn from one another. I'd like to highlight the Success Network dashboard. I know that you can get this data in a variety of areas, but what's unique about the dashboard is that it allows you to compare your data across districts and across leadership communities, not for competition, but to see what you can learn from other communities. You can also benchmark your data with state averages. And we're continuously improving and adding data to the dashboard, and we encourage you to explore it. So network organizers believe that the most effective policies and practices are informed by those who are most impacted by any system. We established a student advisory council that's comprised of students from our leadership communities. And we have 6 representatives here today. I'd like them to stand up and be recognized. And a big thank you to their family members who have joined them and are sitting in the table behind them. During the lunch plenary, you will hear from the SAC members when they share their insights on how we can better support them. I encourage you to come prepared to take notes and take action. So we've made a bit of progress over the last few years since the network was created. Many of you may be familiar with the Postsecondary and Workforce Readiness Act that was signed into law in 2016. The Act uses a student-centered approach to helping students achieve college and career readiness. Implementing the Act has been a key focus of work for leadership communities, and network organizers have provided funding to communities to implement these strategies. So many of them have been early adopters of the elements in the PWR Act, as it's commonly known. So one of the elements of the Act is the College and Career Pathway Endorsement, which demonstrates students' readiness for post-secondary programs and entry-level professional learning experiences in a selected career interest area. We're pleased to see that the number of students earning endorsements continues to rise and that leadership communities are leading the way. We're excited to note that post-secondary institutions across the state are offering incentives to students who have these endorsements on their transcripts, from scholarships to tuition waivers to covering the cost of books. And at lunchtime, we'll hear a little bit about this. As you can see from these slides, we have seen dramatic declines in the number of students who are taking remedial courses in reading and math. And leadership communities had higher rates of remediation rates when the network was created, but they have continued to drop and are continuing to set the pace. This is huge. It means that tens of thousands of students across the state can now enter into credit-bearing math and reading courses at any community college across the state and in some 4-year institutions. This means they save time and money. And we know that often students who have to take remedial courses don't end up graduating. So we're really excited and happy to see these kinds of results, and congratulations for all the hard work that you're doing. Now, we know there are many factors that lead to student success, but we believe that the partnerships and collaboration that's happening between secondary and post-secondary and workforce and community-based organizations within leadership communities is really helping move the needle on this work. So looking ahead, what's next? In the coming year, the Success Networks Policy Committee will create a work group that will explore opportunities and challenges around implementing the college and career pathway endorsement. This is something that we've heard a lot of communities are grappling with, and we want to create a space for people to identify some ways that we can be supportive. And the first meeting of the policy committee is on March 3rd, It's open to anyone who's interested. And the goal of the policy committee is to really make manifest that what happens at the local level should inform what happens at the policy level and vice versa. So please join us if you'd like to learn more about that. We also have 2 webinars coming up in April. One is on communicating the value of postsecondary options to high school students. It will be led by the Michigan Department of Education and the Michigan College Access Network. And one is on April 28th on building pathways to career connections and choice, and will be led by Jobs for the Future, a national organization that works on college policy and practice. So before I sit down, I want to thank a number of people who have made this conference possible. The conference planning committee, comprised of staff from Ed Systems, Advanced Illinois, and ISAC. Please raise your hands to be recognized. Thank you. A special thank you to our MCs, Cheryl Flores and Sam Nelson, who you'll be hearing from later this morning. I also want to thank all the speakers who have taken the time to talk with us and prepare outstanding presentations that will equip us with the knowledge we need and the tools we can use when we return to our communities. A big thank you to our funders, Grand Victoria Foundation and the Joyce Foundation, for their ongoing support. On behalf of the network organizers, thanks again for being here. We're honored to work with so many colleagues who are committed to ensuring that Illinois students have the knowledge and skills they need to succeed. Many of you are here today because you're already doing this work and want to take it further. The door is open, so if you'd like to learn more about becoming a leadership community, please reach out. Any of the network organizers can talk to you about that, and we have badges that say network organizer in orange, so you can find us. Thank you again for being here. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kyle Westbrook, the Executive Director at Education Systems Center at NIU, to introduce our keynote speaker. And for those standing in the back, there are lots of seats at the front. Thank you.
See, I did it, Cheryl. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for making the trip, whether you came this morning, whether you came last night. I'm so happy to see so many friendly and familiar faces here. And at first I thought about just, getting up and just reading off the names of all of the communities that are represented here. And then I realized, like, A, it would take too long, and then B, I'm going to miss somebody. So instead, I'm going to ask folks to just shout yourself out. So, Southern Illinois, where you at? Central Illinois, where you at? Come on, Central Illinois, you are the most well-represented here. You could do better than that. You got up and drove this morning. You didn't drive, last night. Central Illinois, where you at? All right. Western Illinois, where are you at? There you go. Yes, we love the energy. Northern Illinois, including Chicago. All right. And what's encouraging is just the diversity that's represented in this room, and it truly represents the diversity of our state. Regardless of where you come from geographically, the one thing, the common thread that brings all of us together here is our collective desire to do what's right for our students, to make sure that they have the opportunities that they deserve. And so, again, thank you for all of your commitment, your time here today, and your focus on ensuring that our students have what they need in order to be successful in their college and career, in their life beyond that. I have the distinct pleasure to introduce a friend, someone who I'm happy to call a friend, who I first got to know years ago when Dr. Wil del Pilar and former Secretary of Education John King were coming to Illinois to really help build our chops around how we understand disaggregated data and how we then use that data to inform our policy decisions, and how we use that data to make the case that we've got to do more for every single student in Illinois, but particularly, as Edith said, the students who are farthest from opportunity. Have had the great pleasure to work with with Wil over the years on a number of different initiatives, and really there's no more fearless advocate in Washington, D.C. for the students that we care about, whether they are from low-income rural communities, whether they are Black students in urban communities, Latinx students in suburban communities, regardless of where our students are coming from. I'm just thrilled to be able to introduce Wil and his advocacy at the EdTrust. And if you aren't familiar with the EdTrust, they are our nation's leading advocacy organization when it comes to equity in education, both in K-12 as well as in higher education. So I will take a couple minutes and read Dr. Wil del Pilar's bio, because it is worth noting. Dr. Wil del Pilar is a Senior Vice President at EdTrust, a national policy and advocacy group. In his role, Wil spearheads EdTrust's mission to highlight inequities and outline solutions to improve access, success, affordability, and completion in higher education for low-income students and students of color. Prior to joining EdTrust, Wil served in Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf's administration as Deputy Secretary of Postsecondary and Higher Education, where he developed and implemented the state's strategic vision for higher education. Before joining Governor Wolf's team, Wil had experience in the Pennsylvania Department of Education, working as an executive assistant in the state's higher education office. In this role, he managed an array of services for the state, including the College Access Challenge Grant and the Pennsylvania Information Management System. In addition to his policy work, Wil has extensive experience in a variety of roles in post-secondary institutions. Wil holds a doctorate in higher education administration from Pennsylvania State University, a master's degree from Cal State Dominguez Hills, and a bachelor's degree from Chapman University. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Wil del Pilar.
Thank you, Kyle. I don't want you to read my bio because it took like 2 minutes off of the time that I had. And I only had like 20 minutes. I did question our friendship when I saw my itinerary and I saw that I was flying into Illinois in February. And I was like, this has to be a mistake. I can't be flying into Illinois in February, but here we are, and it's beautiful. My name is Wil del Pilar. I'm Senior Vice President at EdTrust, and it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. I've been at EdTrust for around 8 years, and I'd say I've seen the higher education landscape change pretty significantly over the past 8 years. But I come to you not as Senior Vice President at EdTrust. I come to you as the person that I was when I entered this role. And when I got into the higher education space, I fell into this space accidentally. I'm a first-generation, low-income Latino student from LA who was told by his high school counselor that if he wanted to take, he didn't need to worry about SAT prep, because if he wanted to go to college, he can always just enroll at the local community college. And so as a first-generation student, I didn't know whether or how to ask the questions about, like, but why are these other students doing it and I don't have access? Or why are you recommending other people or students in the classes that I'm in, why are they doing it and why are you not recommending that for me? And so my high school counselor actually told, I actually didn't go to college. And so his advice to me was good advice because, or it wasn't good advice, it was bad advice that I heeded because it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I wanted to go, I can go to community college. So I didn't go to college, I worked full time. And I loved reading, and so I bought an SAT prep book, and I used to prep every weekend, and I took the SAT, and I figured out how to do the FAFSA on my own, and I figured out how to apply to colleges, and I got to college, and I became the first person in my family to graduate with that bachelor's degree, and I had 23 members of my family at my college graduation, and I became the first person in my family to graduate with my master's degree 3 years later, thank you. And then I finally became the first person in my family to earn a PhD. And I say all this because Mr. Freeze didn't think I needed to take the SAT. And I've worked at 5 universities across the country. I've worked for 3 governors. I've worked for the former Secretary of Education of the United States. And Mr. Freeze didn't believe in me. And I'll say there are a lot of students who, what I like to call students, unrealized human capital. There are students who are waiting to be invested in, and I was one of those students who was waiting to be invested in. And if I could be here today, how many of your students could be the next guest speaker at this event here and in Illinois? And so I just come to you from a super humble place. I was just at home with my dad. I slept on his sofa couch. It's very humbling to sleep on your dad's sofa couch in Gardena, and he doesn't know what I do, so he's like, my dad is a retired minister. I tell him all the time. He doesn't understand what I do. He thinks I'm a principal or thinks I work in, he used to tell people I was a school psychologist because I did a master's in counseling. So the way he can understand is I tell him I'm an education evangelist. I basically go around and just talk about education. So I come to you like from that space. And what I tell you is the work that we're doing now is more important. It's more important now than ever. The things that we have known and depended on, are at risk, right? And advocates and folks who work in school play a critical role in, number one, access for students and opportunity for students as we think about the changing higher education landscape. All right, so I'm 2 slides behind. So I'll quickly, I only have like 20 minutes, and then Kyle and I are going to have a conversation. So I'm going to try and get through this quickly. If you want a deeper dive, I will be doing a concurrent session, and I'll go deeper into all this data, and hopefully we can have more of a conversation. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the national education landscape. What do we see happening nationally? There's a lot happening. Changing student aspirations. We'll dig into 3 or 4 slides around Illinois-specific data, and then Kyle and I will have a discussion. There won't be time for a discussion between us. I would like that, but that's not going to happen during my time here. So why this moment matters. So we gather at a really critical junction, a moment that demands both resolve and resilience. Education is under a direct and deliberate attack. Decades of progress are at risk of being dismantled right before our eyes. And this moment demands clarity, courage, and above all, collective action. Decisions like Brown versus Board of Education, Plyler versus Doe, and landmark laws such as ESEA, IDEA, and HEA were meant to act as guardrails to ensure access, resources, and justice for students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, students with disabilities, undocumented students, multilingual learners, and students experiencing homelessness. But today, all of these protections are under siege. The challenges we face are clear: proposals to dismantle the Department of Education, federal data, research, and support, and a blueprint. And we know that there's a blueprint in place for dissolving the education, or at best, significantly weakening the Department of Education. The dominoes are falling, and we can clearly see what is happening nationally. These are not abstract policy shifts. They are lived realities with real consequences for students and families everywhere. The administration has shown us a strategy to shut federal agencies. DOGE shuts the door. They order staff to stay home on paid administrative leave. They take control over the data the agency has authority over to do who knows what. They offer folks buyouts. They lay off non-permanent staff. They end all contracts. They engage in the reduction in workforce process, which is the government process for layoffs. For the staff that remain, they make the conditions as terrible as possible in the hopes they will leave. The loss of human capital and institutional memory will have a direct impact on guidance, on support to states, and depending on the systems they eliminate, potentially payments to states in terms of awards and grants and direct awards to institutions. There is a strategy to resist that involves the courts, but we know that the courts take time to act, and these agencies, if they recover, will likely be a shell of themselves. We are already seeing DOGE begin the process at the Department of Education. They will have, or have already withdrawn guidance that Biden or other administrations have issued. They've canceled 80% of federal IES contracts, completely gone our technical assistance for EIR, education, innovation, and research, post-secondary tiered grants, the What Works Clearinghouse, data collection like the condition of education, ERIC, the Education Resource Information Center, and others. We should expect to see the administration use its guidance and convening functions to double down on their anti-DEI, anti-public education, and anti-higher ed agenda. More news, not all good. As February comes to a close, that's right, it's already the end of February. We are in the midst of a process called budget reconciliation. And reconciliation is a special legislative process to advance high-priority fiscal legislation. Reconciliation allows for expedited consideration of certain tax, spending, and debt limit legislation. In the Senate, reconciliation bills aren't subject to filibuster, so you don't need 60 votes. You don't need 60 votes to pass amendments. Given this process, it provides real advantages for enacting controversial budget and tax measures. It's only been used 23 times, and it's a process we're engaging in now. There are lots of things at risk during this year's reconciliation process, and I'm going to list some of the provisions that are on the chopping block for this go-round of reconciliation. The repealing of the SAVE plan and introduction of 2 repayment options for student loans, a 10-year straight 10-year option that would increase everyone's student loan payment by around $200. We've done some modeling on it. And then the other plan, which I call Pay Till You Die, which doesn't have any cancellation on it. It has no cancellation function. So if you borrow $10,000 and you're paying minimum payment, you could be in repayment for up to 37 years. There will be changes to public service loan forgiveness that would make it less generous. There's a proposal to eliminate the Grad Plus and Plus loans writ large. There would no longer be Graduate Plus loans. They would cap graduate loans at around $20,500, and there wouldn't be any Plus loans at all. They're proposing new loan limits for grad and undergrad unsubsidized loans. They're proposing capping Pell Grants based on the cost of attendance. So for example, at community colleges, currently, if your Pell Grant is over the cost of tuition, you can use those dollars for food or book or transportation. That would no longer be the case. They're proposing eliminating the lifetime learning credit and the American Opportunity Tax Credit. They are proposing converting scholarships and fellowships to taxable income, so you'll have to pay tax on that. They're proposing the elimination of deduction of interest rates on student loans, the end of in-school interest subsidies. So if you're currently a student and have a student loan, your interest will start building immediately. They are proposing limiting or ending student protection against predatory institutions. And then one of the, I think, more controversial, is implementing a risk-sharing requirement for federal student loans. And so if you're not familiar with, anyone familiar with risk sharing? I'll give you like a 2-minute or quick explanation. If you are, raise your hand. Okay, if you're not, okay. All right, so risk sharing essentially is a tool that there is being proposed that would require institutions to be on the hook for students, for student loans. So if a student defaults on student loans, the institution has to pay it back, right? And what this does is it de-incentivizes access, because if you're a population of student that defaults at high rates, what is the incentive to enroll you? Because the institution's gonna be on the hook. So for example, rural students and students of color default at higher rates. So there are less incentives for the institutions to enroll those students because they didn't default at higher rates. The institution would then be on the hook if those students default on student loans. There's a lot of folks opposing all of these things at the federal level, but every voice matters, and we need folks to be engaged in this conversation. The savings on these items over 10 years would be used to pay for other priorities of the administration. And so that is what is currently on the chopping block in higher education. So nationally, there's a lot going on in higher education. Better FAFSA has not been better. Attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion continue at the state and federal level. The Supreme Court released a ruling on Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and SFFA. And there's been lots of scrutiny on the admissions process, questions around the admissions process. The recent Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights Guidance letter raises questions around nearly every facet of the work happening in higher education. And then on top of all of this, despite the earnings premium granted for those who earn a degree, there are still lots of questions about the economic return and value of college. I always tell people, just look at the data. The data doesn't lie. It's clearly an economic return. But I still think that there's lots of questions around the economic return. And we see this in the data. This data is from a report by ECMC, and they spoke to students who were or who had just completed high school. And what we see from this data is students are making post-high school decisions that don't involve college. Blue is low-income students, orange is students of color, and gray is first-generation students. Students are making post-high school plans that don't involve college. And part of this may be due to like the COVID years and students questioning hybrid models. But I think there are real perceptions around affordability and student debt that are concerns for students. I think there's a lack of clear messaging from us on the value proposition and earning advantage for college graduates. The context is challenging, but it provides us an opportunity to rethink what we are doing in admissions and curriculum, support services, to ensure that we are serving and not just enrolling students on our campus. So I want to share some data analysis that we did for every institution in the United States. I know you probably came to this presentation not expecting math, but I want to just quickly share this with you. We generate access scores. We generate them for every institution. We generate them for every racial ethnic group. And what we do is look at the population of students at institutions, and we compare that to 18 to 24-year-olds in the state, right? So not super complicated. We then divide that by 100, and we give every institution a score. Are there any institutional folks or leaders here? Raise your hand. They hate to get graded. I'll just say, like they love giving those grades out, but when you give them a grade, I get so many calls about these grades. But we graded every institution, and I have like 7 minutes. So we're gonna cover 3 slides real quick that'll provide us some content. So we gave them grades. I'm not gonna highlight the grades here. I'm gonna talk about percentages so no one gets in their feelings. All right, so this is looking at access for Black students in Illinois over the past 20 years. I'm gonna focus at public four-year institutions, since public institutions enroll over 60% of undergraduate students in Illinois. When we look at the data on Black students, we do see improvements over 20 years. So this is 2020 to 2000 to 2020, right? So it's over 20 years. In the past, when we look at the data for Black students, we see some improvements in Illinois. In the past 20 years, the number of institutions enrolling a proportional number of Black students has doubled, right? So we see good progress by public four-year institutions. In the past 20 years, the number of institutions failing the metric has cut in half. So we see around half the institutions failing this metric. But think about this, 25% of institutions in Illinois are still failing the metric. They don't enroll proportional numbers of Black students. If we're gonna bridge the divide, we need to interrogate, there's 4 institutions, so 4 institutions that are failing this metric. What is happening at these institutions? And if I had more time, and I don't, I would ask you, how do we improve access? And I want you to think about this for my session later. What strategy should we be exploring, especially in the current context, to improve access for Black students? All right, so access for Latino students in Illinois. When we look at Latino students, Illinois clearly had some work to do in this area. In 2000, all but 2 public institutions in the state was failing the metric. 10 years later, no improvement. So look at 2010. It's exactly the same as it was in 2000. All of the progress has been made in the past 10 years. Since 2000, there has been a 33 percentage point decrease in institutions not enrolling proportional numbers of Latino students compared to the 18 to 24-year-old population in the state. But half of the institutions in the state are still failing the metric. Like, this is not acceptable, right? Especially as we think about decreasing enrollments. You have a population of students, and we're simply not enrolling them at institutions. I wish the data on Pell enrollments was better, but it's not, right? So the next slide looks at Pell enrollments in Illinois. This data is from IPED, so it's not mine. I didn't crunch it. I did crunch it, but it's not my data. And it looks at trends in Pell enrollment from 2008-9 to 2020-22. The orange bars we don't have for every year, but I wanted to give us a reference group. And so the orange bar is the percent of students in K-12 that are eligible for free or reduced lunch, right? And so I wanted to use that as a proxy for the 18 to 24-year-old population that we used previously, right? So the proxy to Pell is students who qualify for free or reduced lunch. We would hope that the enrollment of Pell students would be similar to students in free or reduced lunch in higher education. So we expect to see some similar, or we could hope to see some similarities. When we look at the data, we see two clear trends. And what are they? Pell enrollment at public four-year colleges in Illinois has been decreasing since 2011-2012. Has the number of Pell eligible students decreased in Illinois? No, right? Just the enrollment of these students at four-year institutions. In 2022-23, Pell enrollment is 8 percentage points lower than it was at its high in 2011-12. And when we look at the other line, the orange line, there is an inverse relationship between students who qualify for free and reduced lunch and Pell enrollment in post-secondary. The divide between students eligible for free or reduced lunch and Pell enrollment is nearly 14 percentage points different, right? So there is a huge gap. Students who are low income in K-12 and students who are low income in post-secondary, there's this huge divide between those populations of students. How do we begin to think about bridging that divide between the students we're seeing in K-12 and the students that we're enrolling in higher education? There's a wonderful book, and if you work in a rural community, it's called actually Learning to Leave, The Irony of Schooling in a Coastal Community. And it deals specifically with some of the challenges that rural students face in leaving and the pressure of leaving those communities. I'll say a lot of those pressures are very similar to pressures that I felt leaving or thinking about leaving or being told I was leaving the community because I went on to college. And so I would encourage folks to think about how we bridge the divide between what we see in K-12 and what we see in higher education. So I have 1 minute. So these are questions that I would pose later that we should be thinking about, and you should think about at your table, and if I had time, we would engage in this conversation. But we are at a critical moment. We need to step into this moment with our eyes wide open. There will be opportunities for resistance and a need for courage. We have to be aware of the challenges, but we also need to recognize and share opportunities. We need to interrogate the data, identify opportunities, and work in those gaps, those big gaps that we see. Connect with your colleagues and share best practices. There is a need for student supports as they seek to navigate higher education, and the work that you are doing with students is critical. Thank you, and I appreciate the work. It's 9:40, I did it.
I promise we did not purposely match our socks.
I like it.
So first, thank you. Again, thank you for your continued advocacy on behalf of our students all over the country, and in particular, your advocacy for the students who are farthest from opportunity, whether they be rural students, whether they be Black students or Latinx students. You shared a lot. You shared some things about your own kind of personal journey and your own personal experience into higher education. And I suspect that that trend of that kind of gatekeeping, just, it's an unfortunate fact of life in many schools. I'm curious what you've seen around the country that schools or communities, community colleges or counselors, et cetera, are doing to really address not just the gatekeeping, but the broader challenges around enrollment in that transition space between high school and community college or high school and four-year universities.
Yeah, I'll say one of the models that really gives me hope is the state of Delaware. They have built out what I think is the most comprehensive pathway system in the nation. And I know Delaware is small, like it takes an hour to drive through, but you guys have 1,000 school districts, so different challenges. But, I know that from being at that state, they have structured pathway system or models that are the same at every school in the state. So they have an education pathway. So students who are interested in entering education, tough field right now. And so every student graduates with 12 credits of dual enrollment credits aligned to education majors. So if they decide to go on a post-secondary, they have credits in a major, number one. Number two, every student also has a real-life experience every year from 9th grade to 12th grade. So when we toured Delaware and went around different programs, there was one student, she didn't want to be a school teacher. She wanted to be a school psychologist. She knew about school psychologists because she had gotten to actually shadow teachers. And her last year, she was shadowing a school psychologist. So she was able to gain experience in that area. And I think that having experience is valuable for two reasons. One, you get a better understanding of what the field or what the major or what the career track is like. And you also get to see if you don't want to enter that field. And so I think that's as valuable. It's as valuable to know you want to go into something as to know that you don't want to go into something. And so they do that they have like 6 designed career track areas. Students pick one, they could change by the 10th grade. So they have the opportunity for exposure. And I'll say they're doing a really good job getting every student 12 college credits of dual enrollment credit.
So Megan, wherever you're at, we're going to make sure that we connect with Wil and find out who to talk to in Delaware about that. Because, Illinois has a similar architecture in terms of, really defined career pathways. But I think what you would find is even around this room, districts often don't have the same access to the resources necessary to support that kind of robust kind of statewide initiative. So we'll talk a little bit more specifically. But I wanted to sort of move on to another issue that we know is a challenge around the state and really around the country, and this decreasing, this question around the value proposition of higher education. Folks in this room talk to our students and families all the time who will say, why would I go to college? Why would I risk, in some cases, taking on tens of thousands of dollars of student debt? And I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I'm curious if, from the perspective of EdTrust and just some of the things that you've seen around the country, how have you seen folks addressing that question around the value proposition of higher education?
Well, I think part of the problem is really a messaging problem. Like when we read higher education, the higher education press is largely dedicated to selective institutions, Ivy League institutions. And so when you read higher education press and it says it's costing over $100,000 per year, like that's maybe true at Harvard or Princeton, but it's not true at your local regional four-year public college. And most students go to college within 40 miles of their house. And so I think part of the problem is really a messaging problem and an understanding around what it actually costs to go to higher education. I think we have a lot of educating to do in the K-12 space around college opportunity, around different types of institutions. I used to work in college admissions, and I would go ask students, can you name 3 of the state institutions in the state? And they would name private institutions. They would name religious institutions that were not part of the system. And so we expect, we assume knowledge, right? So we make this assumption that because we know it, students know it. And like where we're getting information from is drastically different. And so I would say part of the problem is a messaging problem. The other thing I would say is that we don't have really good data on ROI, number one. And number two, like all the research shows that overwhelmingly students don't use ROI to make decisions. So the Obama administration did all this work in creating the college scorecard because they thought it would change students' decision-making around post-secondary choice and entrance if we post like how much students were earning and how much debt students were taking on. And it didn't change one student's college-going decision. So our assumption that students are making decisions using this data is just, it's just false because the research shows out that they're not using it. And so I do think we have to do a better job connecting outcomes data to decision data, and we're just not there.
Thank you. And, you know, speaking of data, you know, how do we see lots of data, lots of different points with, you know, some of the slides that you presented and some of the slides that'll be presented throughout the day. But oftentimes that data is disconnected from students' lived experiences and, you know, may not necessarily resonate with their lived experience. I'm curious if you've seen or have heard of or how you think of that, both that disconnect between what we see in the data and what our students are often experiencing, and where you see folks getting it right in terms of the contextualization of the data that we have with the way that our students are actually experiencing our K-12 system, our community college system, our higher education system.
Yeah, data is a single reflection of a very complex reality, right? And so when we look at data, we're looking at one point in time on a very, very complicated lived reality and experience. And I think that the best data, and the best data analysis, we use quantitative data to identify the gap and then use qualitative data to understand the problem. And so I think that the only way to really understand what's happening in the data is by talking to students. And so I'll say I think that there are institutions that are doing it really well. I don't know of states that are doing it really well in terms of engaging students, in terms of using the student experience to identify the necessary support services, what the student experience is actually like, where there are gaps in what we're doing. And we do, I'll just say this, as someone who from the higher ed space, we expect higher ed to solve a lot of societal problems. So we expect higher ed to address basic needs. We expect higher ed to address social services, mental health services. It's really, really complicated. There are needs. We're just not meeting students' needs in terms of the social safety net program that we currently have. And so then they're like, higher ed address this. And so I will say I think that it's complex, but the best institutions that I see doing this are using quantitative data to identify the gap, and then they're using qualitative data to bridge that gap.
Thank you. And as you know, you've been around the country and you have, you know, worked in a lot of different states, and you obviously have spent, you know, some significant time over these last years in Illinois and getting to know folks in different institutions and different communities around the state. And as, you know, someone who's not from Illinois but has worked in the state long enough to have an appreciation and understanding of the landscape, what, if anything, in Illinois provides us with a kind of unique opportunity to increase success? And I'm gonna actually caveat that with something you said to me on Friday, which is every state thinks they're a unicorn. Every state thinks we're different. But what do you
Illinois is different, though.
There you go. There you go. That's the right answer. But what do you think are the enabling conditions that can really help us as a state advance, you know, equitable access, success, and completion?
I mean, one of the things I see in Illinois that I don't see in other states is folks moving in the same direction. So I'll say, like, having ISAC here, using the navigators that they have in terms of supporting, for example, FAFSA completion, Advance Illinois, the Partnership for College Completion, the organization that you're with, like all of these, like we don't see a higher education ecosystem of organizations that are pushing in the same direction in other states. So like, I go to a lot of states. There are some states that have nothing. So like in Illinois, in Ohio, for example, your neighbor, the organizations that dominate the higher ed advocacy space are the institutions. And I'll say, like, I love the institutions, but they're not always interested in what's best for students. A lot of times they're interested in what's best for the institutions. And so they're not advocating on how do we improve outcomes for students. They are advocating for how do we improve resources to the institutions. And so one of the things that like gives me hope in Illinois is that there's an active, like really, really well-informed advocacy ecosystem that is pushing for things that I think advance equity in really significant ways. And the other thing I'll say is that it involves student voice. So I'm on, for example, the board for as are you, the Partnership for College Completion. We have student board members, right? And so like they check us if we're like totally off, and sometimes we are totally off, right? And so I think that's important to have students at the table, engaged in the conversation and pushing the conversation forward.
In your work with communities across the country on racial justice and equity, and you alluded to the letters that communities and schools have received, a couple weeks ago. How have communities been responding to the so-called Dear Colleague letter that the Department of Education put out on Valentine's Day of all days? A love letter to our schools, a love letter to our communities.
Well, I joked that it was the only letter that I received on Valentine's Day, so it was not it was a breakup letter for me. But I'll say that I think that, number one, like there's a lot of fear and uncertainty, and that's what we've seen overwhelmingly. And what we overwhelmingly see in these situations is like this overcorrection and institutions actually over-complying with the letter because it was intentionally unclear. And so we've seen this in states, for example, like SFFA versus Harvard in North Carolina. We saw institutions or states move beyond the implementation of the elimination or the significant decrease of use in race admissions to applying that to financial aid. We saw it in Texas with SB 17, which is an anti-DEI bill, and they're like, we have to eliminate everything. It wasn't just, and so there's this over-compliance is what we see by overwhelmingly by institutions when these type of orders come out of, like, there's two reasons. There's some literature on this. It's called repressive legalism. The two reasons are, one, fear of political retribution, and the other is fear of legal action. And so I'll say, like, those, when we read the literature, we see in the literature that institutions overwhelmingly overcomply.
Related to that, we have a wide variety of folks in the audience who, many of them are working directly with our students. Many of them are working, with communities or with state agencies. Sometimes some business folk who are, working at chambers to build pipelines for students into career pathways. And they wouldn't be here if they weren't really deeply concerned or made it their life's mission to support our students. I'm curious, for folks at these various levels who are working with students or on student-related issues, what have you seen others kind of say or do to, I don't want to say create a cocoon, but how, to ensure that we're remaining focused on what's important, which is our students, rather than the noise that's out there?
I mean, I think we have to focus on the work, right? So what is the work that we need to be doing with students? I'll say, like, I work in a lot of states, and like some folks get caught up on the language, and I'm willing to sacrifice the language for the work of, like, how do we improve outcomes for students? And so, I'll go to, like, and I'll say I get pushed by my staff constantly on this, like, or, they'll like, well, we have to use the language of equity, and I'm like, why? Like, can't we use, like, as long as it's the work that is improving student outcomes, isn't that what matters? And I'll say we need to be focused on what is the right work now for advancing opportunities for students. And so I'll say, like, What we see folks doing is focusing and grounding in the data, identifying where there's gaps, and then working in that gap, like bridging the gap in terms of focusing on the data. The language, to me, is less important than how we improve outcomes for students. And so I'll say, like, I'm willing to sacrifice and walk away from like the language of equity, and like I can abandon my pronouns, I'm okay with that. But like I'm not willing to abandon students who we've left behind. And so I'll say, like, the focus needs to be on the students we serve, not so much on the language or what's coming out or what we are reading nationally, but on what do we have to do in terms of our daily work to provide the necessary supports for the students that we work with. And that may be different based on the context in which you are working. And so if you are in a rural community, you may need to do more work around bridging the divide of students actually seeing themselves as on college campuses or college materials. If you're in Chicagoland, like the work may be significantly different because of lack of access to AP or higher level math or science courses. And so what are the needs of the students that you serve, and how do we bridge that divide between what they're getting and what is going to help them to be successful?
And I appreciate what you were saying about the language, because I think it brings up a conversation that we had at EdSystems a couple of weeks ago in the sense of, 30 years ago, people weren't using the language of racial equity. They were doing equity work, and they were committed to the principles of, supporting our students, but nobody was talking about racial equity 30 years ago, and the phrase DEI didn't exist in the way that we think about it, but it doesn't mean that folks weren't doing the work. And so I appreciate what you said about not letting the language be the thing that we get hung up on, because the work is still there and our students are still in need. What's given you hope in this moment?
Well, so I'll say, like, quickly, there is something that gives me hope. There's a lot, like, I do think that change can be really, really hard, right? And so I think managing change is challenging. But the reality is that our current systems weren't serving the students that we serve super well in the first place. And so, like, how do we think about rebuilding a system that is designed to serve the students that are enrolling on our campuses today? If you could, like, blow it up and create a new system that is designed to serve students into high or living wage jobs, what would the supports need to look like? Like we weren't doing great by low-income students, rural students, students with disabilities, like before. Like, we were doing better. Like, I think the data is important. But what would it look like if you could reallocate resources? And don't think within the current box, think outside of the box. What would it look like, right, to redesign a system? And so, like, I am, like, doing lots of thinking about, all right, like, this doesn't exist anymore. If I could redesign it and get resources, what would it look like to create the necessary supports to serve the students? And that's like returning students, students with some college no degree, adults with no credential, current students in K-12. What would it look like to design a system that serves those students and helps them persist to some credential of value to them? And it doesn't have to look the same to everyone. So, like, don't think I'm up here, like, talking about college for all. Like, my son is enrolled in an apprenticeship program at community college, right? And he's doing an apprenticeship in auto mechanic. Like, that's what he wanted to do. And so I support him in navigating that pathway. And it was really complicated to help him navigate that pathway. And so I'll say, like, I think we have to, number one, rethink what the pathways look like, what do the supports look like, and how do we help students get to those pathways that are going to get them to a living wage.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Wil, and please join me in thanking Dr. Wil del Pilar.